The darkness in the Amazon warehouse was absolute, with only the tiny lights of machinery casting vague reflections on the concrete floor. The lines of shelving stretched to the horizon, creating the illusion of an endless maze. Jacob Blake, a new employee, stood in the center section of the warehouse. His watch read 3:12 a.m., the deepest hour of the night, when even the bravest are lost in their fears. He had always thought of night shifts as something sinister. The silence, occasionally broken by the sounds of automated carts, created a sense of unease, as if the warehouse space was becoming alien. During the first weeks of operation, everything seemed normal, but recently rumors began to circulate among the employees. They talked about mysterious noises coming from the farthest corners of the warehouse and shadows flitting between the shelves. Jacob thought they were just jokes, fictions born of fatigue. But something began to change. Around midnight, he heard a whisper. At first, the sound seemed faint and elusive, but then it took on a clearer shape. It sounded like a human conversation, but when he looked around, he saw no one. A few hours later, when his partner went on a break, things started to escalate. He heard a louder sound, a thumping sound like boxes being knocked over. The flashlight illuminated only endless rows of boxes, among which one was lying on the floor. He picked it up, feeling an inexplicable coldness, like a breath touching the back of his neck. His heart began to race. Several more times he heard vague sounds that were difficult to explain logically. Later, the feeling of an invisible presence was added to this. Every moment in the darkness brought new details. Footsteps that seemed to be approaching, creaking fabric, or a metallic sound that was dragging across the floor. The lights began to flicker, increasing the sense of unease. At some point, the entire warehouse was plunged into darkness. Something fell behind several rows of shelves, forcing him to rush toward the exit. The door was locked, and the unknown was approaching from behind. The cold breath felt on the back of his neck seemed more real than any other fear. His phone suddenly beeped, a message urging him to leave the place. He realized that the warehouse hid something much more than just boxes and shelves. The warehouse was enveloped in a deep, thick darkness that swallowed up every sound and movement. Jacob stood in the middle of a vast maze of shelving, breathing in the cold, damp air that smelled of cardboard, dust, and something else elusive but disturbing. After receiving the mysterious message, his phone suddenly turned off, leaving him without the slightest connection to the outside world. Absolute silence reigned around him, occasionally broken by distant sounds like moving boxes or squeaking wheels. Every second in the darkness seemed endless. Moving carefully between the rows, Jacob could feel the tension building. His fingers were clutching the flashlight so tightly that it almost dropped when suddenly a moving light appeared around the corner. It was weak, flickering, and resembled a candle. But what could be burning in this sterile environment? He decided to follow the light, even though his instincts told him to stay put. His steps became heavier and heavier, and the feeling of an alien presence grew stronger. As he got closer, he saw a shadow moving on one of the shelves. It was unnaturally thin and seemed to slide rather than walk. The shadow didn't seem to have a physical body, but its presence was as strong as if it were there. Jacob froze, feeling his heart pounding in his chest and cold sweat beading on his forehead. The shadow suddenly disappeared, but a whisper replaced it. It was louder and clearer than before, as if many voices were speaking at once. Now he could make out the words. They sounded like crying, calls for help, long whispers that chilled him to the bone. The air in the room became thicker, heavier. The flashlight flickered as if the battery was running low, but that was impossible, as he had charged it before his shift. Suddenly a box fell in front of him. The dull thud made Jacob flinch, almost dropping the flashlight. The box was damaged, as if it had been torn open by long claws. There was a ribbon protruding from the middle, torn into small pieces. When he opened it, he saw that it was empty. However, there was something written inside. Black letters, as if carved with a knife, formed a phrase: "We will not leave you." Fear gripped him completely, but he heard the sound again. Now it was a soft laugh, mocking, cold, and indifferent. Looking back, he saw a silhouette standing at the end of the row. The figure was blurry, but there was something familiar about its features. The eyes, which seemed to glow from within, were directed directly at him. It was an impossible sensation. The shadow seemed both distant and close. It began to move toward him, gliding over the ground. Jacob stepped back, trying to keep the flashlight on the figure, but the light grew weaker until it went out completely. In the darkness, he was consumed by absolute panic. He could hear his heart pounding like a drum and his heavy breathing, which seemed foreign. Footsteps were heard again, but now they came from all directions. Blinded by fear, he started running, not knowing where he was going. He hit one of the shelves and fell down, losing his flashlight. Now he was completely at the mercy of darkness. Shadows flashed before his eyes, but they seemed to move no matter where he looked. Then, at that moment, he realized that he was not alone. Something touched his shoulder. It was cold, slippery, and heavy like someone else's hand. Rising to his feet, he rushed to the exit without looking back. But his every step was accompanied by heavy footsteps behind him. The warehouse was coming to life, as if the entire space was working against him. When he finally reached the door, he realized that it was locked again. In desperation, he tried to kick it open, but it was useless. Turning back revealed a new scene. The entire corridor of shelves was filled with shadows. They were frozen like statues, but their eyes were glowing, forming a kind of living maze. Jacob felt his mind begin to fog. He stood there, terrified, not knowing what to do. But then all the shadows began to move toward him at the same time, merging into a massive stream of darkness that swallowed him whole. The warehouse Jacob knew was gone. He woke up in a completely different reality that resembled a distorted memory of the room. All the shelves were twisted like molten metal, and the air was filled with the smell of burning and decay. The light barely penetrated the thick haze, broken into dim spots that only emphasized the overall oppressive atmosphere. His body was heavy, and every movement was made with extreme effort. Boxes were scattered on the floor, but inside them were no longer goods, but strange objects that resembled fragments of burnt textiles and bones. Suddenly, an image appeared in front of him. It seemed to be carved in the air. Shadows intertwined to form the face of a man who seemed to be begging him. Every step in this world seemed to be a plunge into another story. Images from the past began to appear around Jacob, revolving around the warehouse. He saw how the building had once been a textile factory. Dozens of people worked here, sewing and ironing. But suddenly, the room was engulfed in fire, and the screams merged into a chaotic stream of horror. The ghosts that now filled the warehouse were those who could not escape from this hell. The scenes became clearer and clearer. He saw women and men, their distorted faces covered in ash and tears, their hands trying unsuccessfully to find a way out. The flames seemed to be alive, consuming everything in its path, turning life into solid ash. It seemed that time did not exist here. because even after many years the energy of this horror remained. The ghosts began to approach him. Their bodies were as transparent as fog, but the sense of presence was almost physical. Their voices sounded like whispers that overlapped in a multi-voice chorus. They did not attack him, but their pain and suffering penetrated his consciousness. Jacob felt his mind fill with terror with every second of this encounter, leaving no room for any other thought. He realized that he had to act. The shadows were not just here to scare him. They were looking for release, looking for someone to complete their story. He recalled old legends about places that hold memories of tragedy and thought that this warehouse might be just the place. As he made his way through the distorted shelves, he tried to find any trace that would indicate the cause of these events. His attention was drawn to a huge safe that stood in the very center of the warehouse. It was covered in rust, but still looked sturdy. In the door of the safe was a sign with a carved inscription, "The truth will set us free." Jacob realized that this could be the key, but the safe was locked, and the code was unknown. He began to look for clues among the rubble and boxes. Every object he touched seemed to be filled with memories. Images of the people who had worked here, their faces, their voices came to him. Among them, he noticed one figure that stood out. It was a man in an old-fashioned suit. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of pain. He didn't move, just looked at Jacob, as if urging him to follow him. Jacob took a few steps and noticed that his every movement was accompanied by an increase in noise around him. He could see the flames engulfing the factory over and over again, like a time cycle that never ended. The figure led him to an old archive office. Opening a drawer, he found yellow documents containing the names and photographs of workers. Among them were those he had seen in his visions. One document in particular caught his attention. It was a complaint about the danger of the equipment that had been filed a few days before the fire. It was signed by the same man who had brought him here. Jacob began to realize that the cause of the tragedy was not just an accident. It was negligence, the refusal of management to listen to the workers. He could feel the anger and grief of those souls filling the room as he read each line. The figure of a man showed him the way back to the safe. In his head, he heard words that seemed to come from the room itself. "Tell our story." The safe opened as Jacob typed in the date of the fire he had seen in the documents. Inside was a book filled with records of the factory, its workers, and the tragedy. It was almost ritually decorated, like a sacred text. When he touched it, Jacob felt a powerful flow of energy pass through him. He saw the ghosts begin to disappear, their figures dissolving in the light, leaving only silence behind. The warehouse returned to its normal state. The lights were no longer flickering, and the air was cleaner. Jacob realized that he had done what he had to do. He had freed the souls that were tied to this place and allowed them to find peace. But this story left an imprint on him that he could never forget. He left the book in the security department of the warehouse, with an annotation explaining its significance. His last words in the report were, "The memory of the past must live on so that such tragedies never happen again." Jacob walked out of the warehouse, leaving behind a room that no longer seemed so ominous. The light of the morning was breaking through the clouds, as if to mark a new beginning. But his heart remained heavy. He knew that his work was not yet done, for the weight of the truth he had uncovered was too great to leave hidden. He spent the next few days researching, gathering as much information as he could about the factory and the fire. The incidents that had occurred at the warehouse were not isolated. He found records of other places where similar tragedies had left their marks. Rooms filled with pain and suffering turned into traps for souls that could not find peace. Jacob decided to write a detailed report for the local authorities and also contact journalists to tell the story. He described everything he saw and felt, adding the documents he found as evidence. His goal was not only to expose past tragedies, but also to ensure that people were aware of the danger and remembered those who suffered. The publication of the story caused a significant response. People began to share their own stories of unusual events in old buildings. Some of these places also turned out to be connected to tragedies. Jacob became part of a movement aimed at uncovering forgotten stories and helping those who suffered from the consequences of these events. The Amazon warehouse was temporarily closed for inspection. At first, the company's management tried to refute Jacob's statements, but under public pressure, they were forced to conduct their own investigation. The facts revealed confirmed his words. The company allocated funds for the restoration of the warehouse and the creation of a memorial in honor of the factory's dead workers. Jacob, however, did not stay to see this work completed. He felt he had done all he could and now had to move on. But the memory of the events in the warehouse left a deep mark on him. He started writing a book in which he collected all his experiences and research. It became a way for him to find his own peace. The last scene that remained in his memory was a vision of a man in an old-fashioned suit. He stood at the entrance to the warehouse, looking calmly at Jacob, and then disappeared, leaving only a feeling of relief. Jacob realized that he had freed not only souls, but also himself from the burden of fear. The story of the Amazon warehouse has become a lesson for many. It reminded us of the importance of memory, responsibility, and humanity. And Jacob Blake, who dared to face the darkness, became the voice of those who remained silent.